All right, young philosophers, here we're beginning our first video in a series of trying to recreate a class experience online. And just like in our normal classes, we're going to begin with a focus question. And this time our focus question is going to be, can an opinion be wrong? Now, by now, I expect you have already answered this question in the discussion boards and perhaps engaged with some other folks. But let's reflect on it here. Can an opinion be wrong? Well, I could see reasons both for yes and no. Yes, an opinion can be wrong, and no, an opinion can't be wrong, right? Well, let's start with yes. When might an opinion be wrong? Well, perhaps an opinion would be wrong if someone says something that's factually inaccurate, right? Someone says something that simply doesn't fit with reality itself. Like you say that it's raining right now, and actually I look outside and I can see the sun and it's shining beautifully. So you could say something that, like, as in a kind of opinion statement, where I think it's raining outside, well, and it isn't, right? Another reason, I've actually have an interesting reason I've heard people give that an opinion could be wrong would be something like saying that an opinion sometimes can be almost morally wrong, right? And what do we mean by morally wrong, right? That someone might be giving an opinion that's hateful towards others, right? That could be somehow damaging to other people, and so it's sort of it's not so much wrong in terms of incorrect, but there's like a wrongness in kind of expressing that opinion. I've heard people say this. It's an interesting kind of thought. So. Okay, so these are some reasons why an opinion might be wrong. On the flip side, though, some would very easily argue that opinions can't be wrong, right? And so why might someone say an opinion can't be wrong? Here, I've got another mark. This guy's a little thinner, but let's see how it works, all right? Why not? Well, on one hand, someone might simply try to go to the definition of what an opinion is. An opinion might simply express how I feel, right? And now, if an opinion fundamentally expresses how I feel, to say that an opinion is wrong is you're telling me that I don't feel the way, or I shouldn't feel the way that I feel, right? And how can I feel any differently than the way I feel? Like, the way I feel is the way that I feel, right? And so I can't. Can my feelings be wrong? You might ask. Can my feelings be wrong? Similarly, we might ask the question. Another way of thinking about opinions might not just be my feelings, but it's my views. It's my view of things, right? It's my view of the world, right? And so, are you going to say that we know that everyone's entitled to their own view? We say people are all entitled to their own opinions. Everyone can have their own opinion, right? So, can an opinion be wrong, right? If everyone's entitled to how they feel and their own views. But on the flip side, if someone says something that's actually inaccurate, how can that still say that an opinion is wrong? Well, we might even think about a test. Say you were given a test by a teacher and you knew there was going to be an opinion question. Some people rejoice, some people lament, but what does this mean? You're probably going to write some kind of essay but the key there that you might say is, if it's an opinion question, you can't be wrong in terms of what your answer is. Maybe at most, what a teacher would be grading you on is how you defend your viewpoint, right? But in this case, then it still wouldn't be that the opinion is wrong. It's just a matter how good of a defense you have of that opinion. Now, thinking about things along these ways is going to be really important as we try to understand Plato and Aristotle in some important ways. And I'd argue the first thing that we might say and might think about is how, in fact, when we try to understand who Plato was, when Plato was engaging people in philosophical questions, we could first see that he actually was challenging us to a new level in thinking about our opinions, right? And challenging us to think about our opinions in new ways. To help us, I think, decide, can opinions be wrong? Let's look at a couple of examples here. Here are two statements that would be worth considering and how they're fundamentally different, right? And if we can see the difference between them, we might see how we can answer the question, can an opinion be wrong, right? So how are the following two statements different? Well, let's read. I think climate change is the most pressing issue to consider during the upcoming election cycle. Climate change is the most pressing issue to consider during the upcoming election cycle. What's fundamentally different here? It's actually only 2 words. Do you see? 2 words are right here. I think. All right. This guy begins with, I think climate change is the most pressing issue to consider during the upcoming election cycle. And this guy just states the view, right? So when we think about whether opinions can be right or wrong, in some ways, it comes down to fundamentally how we think about the statements we make. When we say, I think climate change is the most pressing issue, we need to think of, or the second statement, we really need to think about what the object is of each of these statements. In other words, what are these statements actually referring to? And this first statement is fundamentally talking not so much about climate change, it's talking about I. It's talking about the speaker. Right? This kind of statement, speaking about the speaker, is fundamentally a kind of autobiographical statement. Autobiographical. If I can only write biographical, right? These thick markers are better to see, but good Lord, that says autobiographical. I apologize. My handwriting is hardly better in a video than it is in the real world. Isn't that sad? Right? Fundamentally an autobiographical statement where when I say I think say something like this statement really is supposed to reveal something about the person doing the speaking. The second statement, what's it about? Well, it's about whatever issue is the most pressing issue. This statement, right, is not so much about the speaker, it's about the thing they're speaking about. It's ultimately a kind of proposition, right? Proposition. About the world, right? And you might ask yourself, okay, in both of these situations, what would it mean for this statement to be wrong, right? Well, this first statement, for it to be wrong, would ultimately say that this autobiographical statement by this speaker is not an accurate description of that speaker. If it's wrong that I think climate change is the most pressing issue, then what you're trying to say is I don't actually think what I say I think, right? And in this way, I would say for the most part, we'll say opinions can't be wrong, right? It's very unusual for someone to be wrong about what they think, right? Though, I don't know, I've had some very close friends who've actually helped me see some of the things that I think are not what I actually think, right? But that's reserved for the people closest in your life to help you realize you don't necessarily think what you think. Or maybe Socrates, who walks around the city of Athens challenging people, right? This other statement, for it to be wrong, well, it would simply mean that climate change is not the most pressing issue. And in fact, that's plausible. It's plausible that this proposition, in fact, could be false, right? So this kind of statement can be wrong. So one of the first things I want to point out here, and this is a general idea, that when we state our opinions, a lot of times we end up stating them in this first kind of way, and that's the safe way to state them. It helps us avoid the possibility of being wrong. If I couch everything that I think with the beginning statement, I think, and then someone says, you're wrong, then I could say, hey, slow down. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. I can think whatever I want to think, and you just have to hear me say what I think, right? However, here, if I state my opinions in this way, now I'm opening myself up to criticism. Now I'm opening myself up to being wrong, but I'm engaging with the world, and I would argue in a more authentic kind of way. And I would argue that this is the world that Socrates wanted us to engage in. And this is how he wanted us to engage in our ideas. When Socrates goes around and he starts asking for the definitions of things, he's trying to say that we can't be satisfied with just saying what we think and repeating what some other famous people had to say about issues. We need to engage in these things and actually seek the truth of the questions themselves to get to the actual true definitions, to seek the propositions, to seek the most truth in the kind of propositions people would make about the world, right? And that's what Socrates was challenging us to do. And in general, when we reflect on Socrates, he was very, very critical of the very notion of an opinion. And remember, he said that you either have knowledge that's fundamentally rooted on the grasping the definitions of things, or you are ultimately in the world of shadows, in the world of images, right? So let's take this discussion, right? And this idea here that sometimes it's very difficult to be wrong when you're only talking about yourself, but that's not really the way we should be speaking. We should be speaking in terms of the actual propositions and about the things that we actually care about. Let's take a step back and let's reflect on Plato and actually where we're going with Aristotle, because this particular lesson in this part of our courses, we're transitioning to studying Aristotle. So to help us think about Aristotle, actually, I'm going to begin with this image here. This is a painting. I believe it's a fresco. It was by Raphael in the very early 1500s, and it's somewhere in Vatican City. And as you can see here, we have this hall that's full of, actually, believe it or not, famous Greek thinkers and philosophers. Pythagoras is in here. I believe Euclid is in here, but we also have some famous guys. I think Thales is in here, and maybe Anaximander and Anaximenes. Heraclitus, I think, is in somewhere in here. But if we kind of look here, when I look at this image, and we usually would have a longer discussion in class, but when we look at this image, I see myself sort of drawn to the center, to these two figures. And what I did is actually printed out that too. Man, I was really blowing through ink on my printer. So we could focus on these two folks. And these two folks are two very important philosophers for us. They represent Plato and Aristotle. Now, here's my first question. Which one's Plato and which one's Aristotle, do you think? Yeah? This guy is Plato. Good guess. How can you tell? Well, number one, we hopefully remember from class that Plato was a teacher of Aristotle, so he should probably be older. Notice the older looking dude. But also, there's a couple other really important things for us to point out. Just take for a second, try to see some differences in what you see and how these two guys are depicted. One of the things that I see is that Plato, notice his hand, he's got a finger that's sort of pointing up. He's pointing up, and that while Aristotle has a hand that's sort of pointing out like this. We also will see that Plato, if you look at his feet, he seems to be almost on the ball of his feet, sort of lifting himself in the air, going with that finger pointing, while Aristotle's feet are firmly on the ground. A couple of interesting things. You notice as well, too, they're both holding books, but, and believe it or not, on the spines of these books, there's titles there. This title here is Timeo, and that should remind you of something. What does it remind you of? The Timaeus? Yes. Remember when we studied Plato's Timaeus? In the Timaeus, we talked about time and eternity, and that's a fundamental concept at the center of Plato's thought. Aristotle here we see represented with a book called, it's kind of hard to see, but it's Ethica? Ethica, referring to the ethics. The Nicomachean Ethics is the book we're going to fundamentally reading with Aristotle here. And so Raphael, in painting this, points to these two works as important works here. But what's the deeper philosophical differences that I think are being communicated by this painting, right? Well, one of the first things are that Plato is always pointing up, right? Remember, for Plato, he said that we have to get to the world of the forms fundamentally. That's our ultimate goal. And that all of our opinions and all of our any knowledge that we're going to have at all in the world is ultimately going to be rooted on how well we first grasp the forms. You have no knowledge whatsoever without the forms, right? And it's only through the forms that you could sort of go back into the cave of experience and start to try to say something meaningful about that. So Plato has this idea that we're going to begin we have to get to the forms fundamentally as our starting point, and then we can move to experience. Well, Aristotle, he says, Plato, chill, dude. Right? Check it out, man. How the heck are we going to get to the forms first before anything else if we're going to try to get to grasp the true definitions of things? He says, how else are we going to grasp definitions without really digging into experience itself? And so Aristotle is going to have the opposite motion, right? He's going to say that if we really want to get to the nature of reality, we need to dig into our experiences in a much deeper way than we ever have before, right? So if we think about, I'm going to go to a couple other ideas here, right? That when Plato, when he talked about knowledge, he says knowledge begins with grasping the definitions of things, right? Actually, I have a second version of this paper that I didn't write on, right? That was an earlier draft. Sorry. Knowledge begins with grasping the definitions of things, right? And the true definition of thing was the form. It was the perfect reality, the true thing itself. Remember how we use tons of examples to talk about forms, but one of my favorite is this guy. What's that? You're probably saying it's a triangle. But if you remember from class, we've had a discussion. Is this truly a triangle? No, it's really just a shadow of a triangle. Why? Because a triangle is a perfect polygon with perfect straight line segments, and it's perfectly closed. This thing reminds us of a triangle, but it isn't truly what a triangle is. This thing over here that I'm drawing right now could also remind you of a triangle, and it participates in what a triangle is, but it isn't a triangle in its trueness. And so Plato, when he looks at experiences and opinions, he's going to say that they're always partial and incomplete, and ultimately they need to be rejected in favor of grasping the true form itself, right? That's what Plato is really after. This whole idea, we'll see, gets to be in the history of philosophy called something like rationalism, where we start talking about how reason alone, that says rationalism, sorry, it's off the edge. Rationalism means that through reason alone we can get to knowledge of things. Aristotle on the flip side, right? Aristotle says, okay, as much as I get you that there's some incompleteness and imperfection to the things that we observe, he says we don't really have anywhere else to start. Knowledge begins with the appearances, and what are appearances? Appearances are two things. Appearances are, number one, the experiences that I directly have of things in the world, and number two, the appearances are the opinions that I communicate about my experiences. So for instance, when I go to a restaurant and I have a great meal, I like to tell people about it. When I see a movie that was terrible, I want to tell you about it. If I hear this funny thing that sort of was crazy, I want to tell you about it. We want to share about our experiences, and the opinions we have are really the way in which someone else's experiences are revealed to me. It's when an other's experiences reveal the world to me. The world to me. And what Aristotle is ultimately going to say then, right, that Plato, okay, all right, you want to start with the forms, right? You want me to get out of the world that I experience to get to the true forms before I'm going to really know anything about the world itself. And Aristotle is going to say, I don't see how I can do that. How can I get to these forms? How can I get to these true definitions? Except through the way of experience, through a careful examination of our experiences. So what we're going to see here in Aristotle, he's going to develop this method of dialectic. And in his method of dialectic, he's going to carefully examine the experiences we have, carefully examine the opinions, knowing that they are wrought with problems, that the experiences and the opinions we have are wrought with contradictions and incompletenesses and inadequacies, but it's precisely through these experiences and the opinions that things will reveal their true natures. And so for us, the task of the philosopher is to dig deeply into experience and see what it can show us about reality itself, right? So, for Plato, can opinions be wrong? Plato doesn't even want to engage with opinions. He says, at most, an opinion is some mixture between being and non-being. I suppose there's some shadow of reality to it, but he emphasizes on the darkness of those shadows and how we need to get out of the cave with the allegory of the cave to the reality of things. Well, Aristotle, he's going to say, yes, but there's, even if it's just a little bit of light about reality that comes through people's experiences and opinions, it's precisely those experiences and opinions that if we dig into and we examine carefully and philosophically will lead us to the truths that we desire, lead us to the definitions we seek to know, and to wisdom, to answers about why. So in the next video, we're going to examine Aristotle and his view of dialectic in a little bit more detail. There you go. Peace and wisdom. Giddy the heck up. Have a beautiful day.